Here a while back, the CBS news anchor, man, Dan Rather, who I know all of you have heard and seen. Here a while back, he told a story about when he was a young boy, how his grandparents took him to a tent revival in Bloomington, Texas. I don't know if you've ever attended any of those tent revivals that come to a community, but back in those days, it was quite the spectacular event. Everyone in town would show up to it. They would erect a large tent. They would throw a bunch of sawdust on the ground to walk on, and they'd set the chairs up. And normally the preacher would start off kind of subdued and just pulling the people along. And as the message went on, he would escalate his intensity, normally trying to get these people to be convicted of their lack of faith in how they lived. Well, there was one night during that revival meeting that the preacher had worked himself up to a feverish pitch, as they do. And he was shaking people's loyalty to the Lord. And at the height of his emotions, the preacher reached behind him in a chest that was behind him, and he pulled out 2 snakes, and he tossed them out in the congregation. I guess he was trying to make a point with the snakes and their faith. But the people in the crowd, they weren't too impressed with it, as you can imagine. They just couldn't tell what tossing snakes out to us was going to teach us about our faith. But in the panic, they couldn't tell if they were poisonous or not. And I don't know if you've ever seen cartoon pictures of people exiting a tent, but people went in every direction. They scattered, all in a panic. They were screaming. And Dan Rather, in looking back on that event, he says, it was quite the sight. That was the last time that Dan's grandmother ever attended a revival meeting. I wonder why. She just couldn't see the point of the snakes. And even Dan Rather, he wrote this about that night. I couldn't figure out what the snakes were supposed to have to do with my religious faith, which was and still is just fine. It's in fine shape. And then he put a footnote on, I think. Is that what we do with our faith? I'm doing good, I think. Don't panic. I'm not going to be throwing any snakes at you this morning. But you have to admit that if I were to do that, just like that night when that evangelist did that, what happened? He got their attention. And I would get your attention, or you would get mine. There are times in our lives when we get into a rut, we get stuck, and we kind of need somebody to shake us up, to grab our shoulders and get our attention. That's what we're going to talk about this morning, getting your attention. You been there? Sometimes it's not fun to have somebody getting our attention, but as we look back, it became necessary for us. The only way out of that rut, the only way out of that being stuck, whether it was somebody or some situation that shook us, it woke us up. It got our attention. In the scripture we're going to be looking at this morning, Jesus, once again, he certainly had this kind of effect, especially on the religious establishment of that time. In this scripture, Jesus had been looking forward to going to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. But when Jesus arrived at the temple, he became upset by what he saw. There in the temple courtyard, there were people that were buying and selling cattle and sheep, had little cages of doves. The merchants there, kind of, I don't know if you've ever been to a stock show or something like that, you can kind of picture that. Smelly, dirty, noisy. But the people that were providing this thought that they were providing a service to the people by giving them the opportunity to buy some stock of some kind or other as their tithe, to be presented as their tithe. The other thing that was happening there was that there was temple workers, people employed by the temple that were there to exchange coins. Now at that time, the temple had its own currency. So any currency that you were bringing to the temple to tithe to or donate to the temple had to be changed over to temple currency. And if you've ever gone out of the country, you've probably gone through that. If that country used a different currency than what our currency is, you'd have to exchange that for their currency. Well, these temple employees also were thinking that they were presenting a service to those that were coming to the temple. The problem was that they were taking advantage of the people in the Lord's house. They were charging large fees to exchange that currency. It's documented in other places that they were charging as much as a day's wage to transfer, to exchange that currency into temple currency. A day's wage. And of course, as society goes, it seemed like the more money they made, the more they started charging for this service. It went to higher rates even than a day's wage. So Jesus was upset by what he saw. Now, we're not accustomed to this side of Jesus, right? We kind of think of Jesus as always being kind and loving and easygoing to everyone he encounters, right? And that is an accurate picture of Jesus until it came to the religious leaders of that day, taking advantage of those that they were supposed to be helping. And so Jesus was so angry that he felt he had to do something to get their attention. We're just going to read this scripture and then we'll come back and break it down a little bit. We're in John 2. We're going to be looking at verses 13 through 20. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned the tables. To those who sold the doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to be able to do this?" And Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up again in 3 days." Well, they replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you were going to raise it in 3 days?" But the temple he was speaking of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, Jesus' disciples, his disciples, recalled what he had said. Then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. So, I think we can safely say that Jesus was getting their attention. Jesus was going all Chuck Norris in the temple courts. And he also used this situation to teach them and to teach us. By the way, have you ever heard that Chuck Norris is the one that created the giraffe when he uppercut a horse? Yeah, let's get back to the message here. Think about it. Back to our scripture. What can we learn from this scripture? Doesn't seem like Jesus, does it? Well, I didn't know if I wanted to bring this message or not, being honest with you. So just remember that. Because it hits home. And it kind of disturbs the image that that we have of Jesus. Jesus, angry. These two words don't seem to go together, right? But something we see out of this is, first point that I'm going to bring, is there are times in our lives when it's all right to be angry. There are times in our lives when it's all right to be angry. Maybe that's the first thing that we need to look at this morning. Sometimes we get this idea that because we are disciples, that we are following Jesus, we should be gentle, tender, always calm. Kind of people who never show wrath. Paul Harvey, a while back, Paul Harvey tells about a robbery attempt in Oceanside, California. This robber had come into the bank. He was wearing a motorcycle helmet, and he was carrying a gun. And he was looking at the tellers that were behind the counter, looking for an easy mark, She'll put that way, looking for somebody. One he picked out, better go this way. The lady that he picked out was a lady probably in her 50s, just looked real sweet and real calm, looked real nice. And he went up to her and handed her a note. And in that note, he said, "Give me all your cash, or I'll kill you." Well, this grandma type of person, she just kind of calmly reached to get her cash drawer. But she read the note again, a second time. And you could just kind of see the fury come up in her eyes, and her lips got clenched. And she pulled that cash drawer all the way out of the cabinet and proceeded to beat him over the head with it. Again and again and again. She was scolding him, and money was flying everywhere as she was beating him. And she was shouting shame on him, and she bounced blows off of his helmet. Well, this young man didn't know what to do and ran out of the bank. Well, the police caught him not very far from the bank, all hunkered down in a bunch of shrubs trying to hide. But when the police came back in, was talking to this teller, they asked this woman how come she was about to give him the money at gunpoint, and then all of a sudden, instead, started this rage with this cash drawer, and beating him. And this is what she said. In his note, there was a very naughty word. People have different things that trigger our anger, right? There are times when all of us get angry, whether we'll admit it or not. I know you will, to yourself anyways. We all get angry from time to time. And sometimes the worst thing that we can do is to hold that anger in. Now, here I'm going to put a footnote. This isn't a license to be angry all the time. This isn't a license to exert your anger anytime you want. That's not what Jesus is doing here. Sometimes it's hard, it's not good, put it this way, not good to hold your anger in. There was a study that was done of 139 patients that experienced chronic headaches. The researchers at St. Louis School of Medicine, they found that depression usually accompanies frequent headaches. Moreover, that suppressed anger, holding anger in, increases the depression, and thus, in turn, it increases the severity of the headaches. It's a vicious circle, notes Paul in the Duckrow. How would you like a last name of Duckrow? That this is this doctor that this quote is going to come from. He is an associate professor of psychiatry and human behavior and the director of Biobehavioral Treatment Center. It's a long title there. But this is what he says. Patients with chronic headaches get depressed because they're in pain. And the pain interrupts their lives. You've ever had a headache? You understand that. In turn, the depression then makes the headache worse. And if the patient is one who tends to hold in anger, the more depressed he is, or she is, and the more severity they have with the headaches. Anger in itself is not the problem. The problem is the tendency to avoid expressing it appropriately that seems to be associated with increased depression. Like we said earlier, everyone gets angry from time to time. Sometimes the worst thing that we can do is to deny that anger, hold it in, let it build in us kind of like a big old pressure pot, just waiting to explode, to release. Now, of course, it's not always a person who is responsible for, it's not always a person who is responsible for our anger. Sometimes it's different situations that we face, that we get into. Like Jesus' anger here with the money changers at the temple. And before I get to the second and third point with this, I want to remind you. Ask this question maybe. Why did Jesus get so angry? Why did Jesus get so angry? And I think that we pass over that question because Jesus isn't supposed to get angry. We're not supposed to get angry. So what caused Jesus to get so angry, to explode in that temple? Well, I'm not 100% sure of this scripture. I'm trusting my memory, which isn't very trustworthy. But I think it's in Deuteronomy 14, chapter 14, where it talks about tithing. And what it says is that for those that are tithing a portion of what the goodness that they have received, they're supposed to tithe 10%. But if and part of that tithe could be your livestock. It could be your produce that you grow and that you sell and so forth. It could be currency. But for those that had to travel a long way to get to Passover, it was kind of tough to drive your livestock to be able to do that. So it was put into the Levitical law that they could sell that they were going to donate to the temple, their tithe. They could sell that for silver and carry that with them, because it's a lot easier to carry a purse than to carry a cow. And then once they got to Jerusalem, they could use that money to purchase their tithe to the temple. And that is what is going on here. You remember when, at the beginning of this, I said that these people that were selling the cows and the lambs, the sheep, the doves, were thought that they were doing a service to the people. Those that came a long ways there to present their tithe. So they thought they were giving them a service. The problem was that they were taking advantage of them, like we talked about. The other problem here is that if you look at Deuteronomy 14, 12 or 14, it doesn't say anything about buying those cattle, that whatever you're going to donate, in the temple. It would have been outside of the temple. But here when Jesus comes, they are in God's house with these critters, taking advantage of God's people. So this instigates then Jesus' anger. remember that. What caused Jesus to get angry? They were taking advantage of God's laws for their own benefit. And they were defiling God's holy temple. So Jesus gets angry. And sometimes for each one of us, it's okay to get angry. The second thing about anger is, how do we handle this anger? What do we do with it? Sometimes anger can be creative and constructive. Some of the most disgusting social problems that have plagued humanity started because somebody got angry. There was one person that caused whatever that anger was, stimulated that anger, whether it is good or evil. And that can make an enormous impact on our world. There was one day that a customer went to the post office. While that customer was at the post office, they saw a lady throwing paper into the trash can, one of the tellers. And she asked that clerk, that teller, if the post office had a waste paper recycling bin. Well, the teller didn't know. And so it instigated, it sparked something in her to investigate it. And what she found out was that the post office didn't have a recycling program for their paper. No one had ever thought of it. So she decided to start a recycling program. And it took no time that hundreds of pounds of paper that before were thrown into dumpsters and into the landfills were being recycled every week. But she didn't stop there. She became so interested in environmental issues that she encouraged everyone else around her to be responsible with the environment. Well, other workers got more involved in the environment. They pulled their money together and planted a tree in a local park on Earth Day and so forth. But they started getting more involved in this taking care of the environment. And one of the things they did was they set up a bulletin board in the lobby. And they would post all kinds of articles and posters about the environment. And of course, since most of the town went to the post office every day, they would pass that bulletin board. They couldn't avoid having their consciousness pricked about environmental issues. One of the clerks even began writing a column for the local newspaper about the environment issues. And gradually the whole community, their awareness of the environment was raised because of this one question. What are you doing with all that paper? One person saw something, and though it didn't get turning tables over angry, but it started the sequence. Her attention, what got her attention was getting others' attention. one person, that one person can make a difference. Even if they are quiet and unassuming. Of course, we've all heard about Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. So many organizations like that start because of one person seeing something that angers them and doing something about it. This is the story of our communities, simply because somebody got angry. Being angry by what we see can lead to creative and constructive solutions. Jesus got angry. As I was saying a little bit ago, people had traveled great distances to come to the temple for Passover. The temple was one place where they could feel close to God. It was a holy place. It was a place to feel God's presence in their lives. But being surrounded by the commotion of cattle and sheep and the doves flapping their wings and cooing away and the money changers had turned the temple in more of the atmosphere in the temple more into a carnival atmosphere, an arcade type of atmosphere, instead of being a holy place. A place where people could come and pray. There were just too many distractions. And it made it tough. There was just too much noise. Something had to be done. And Jesus, filled with creative anger, made a whip out of some cords, and he drove all the merchants selling animals and overturned the tables where the temple employees were exchanging coins. I don't know if you can get a picture in your mind here of what's going on, but it's a chaotic scene that is taking place. There's feathers flying around, there's cattle and there's sheep bouncing into people trying to get out of there, bouncing into each other. It's just a chaotic mess in there. In the temple courtyard. I have this picture in my mind that if I were filming this, making a movie of this, my last shot of this scene would be a coin circling on the ground until it finally fell over. That's what is happening here. Something had to be done. So Jesus, filled with creative anger, made a whip, and he drove the merchants out of the Lord's house. And you remember what he tells the keepers of the doves there. Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. What stimulated Jesus' anger? They had made God's house into a marketplace, something it was not created to be. So Jesus got their attention. Sometimes anger can lead us to creative and constructive solutions. However, I don't want to just focus on Jesus' anger too much here with this, bringing up the third point. Knowing the rest of the story helps us see Jesus clearly. As you can imagine, this upset the religious officials. Jesus' actions here. And it didn't help his reputation in the temple establishment, shall we call them that? But what did Jesus have to do to get their attention? And that's one of the questions that they come to him and they ask him. Of course, we know that they, through many years, have been looking for the promised Messiah. And many people were telling them that this Jesus was that Messiah that they were looking for. But Jesus didn't fit their parameters. And especially this. The Messiah wouldn't handle this way. So the religious officials, they come to Jesus, and remember in verse 18? What sign can you show us for you doing this? And I'm sure it wasn't a nice little, what sign can you show us that you're doing this? I'm sure there was some anger behind their voices. What gives you the authority to do this? And Jesus answers them, destroy this temple in 3 days, and I will raise it up. What? Can't you just see all of the religious establishment's reaction to this? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days, I will raise it up. This just doesn't make sense. It's kind of like the paradoxes that we looked at last year. What? Just can't figure that one out. Of course, they're thinking of Jesus speaking of the building of the temple, when actually Jesus is talking about himself. And in their state of confusion and disbelief, their hands up, what? They informed Jesus that it had taken 46 years to build the temple. It was not impossible it would be impossible to build the temple in 3 days. But following Jesus' death and resurrection, as we see here in verse 22, we realize that, and his disciples realized, that he was talking about himself, speaking of his death and his resurrection. Bury this body, and within 3 days it will be resurrected. How is it we might say it today? You can't keep a good man down. Particularly if you understand that we are taught in the New Testament that this body, the church, is his body. We are taught that we are the temple. So for Christians, this is the temple. Not a building made of human hands, but a close association of kindred hearts. Wherever people are worshiping Christ and serving him, there is the temple of the living God. So, Jesus raises this question up for all of us. What are you doing that is mistreating God's dwelling place? What are we, the church, what are we doing that is mistreating God's dwelling place? Jesus wanted to get people's attention. He did it with a display of anger. Sometimes it's good to get angry. Anger can lead us to creative and constructive solutions. And in Jesus' case, here he wanted to make a point that God is not to be found in a building. God is to be found in the fellowship of his people. What are we doing with his temple? Father, it's a good question for all of us to dwell on today and tomorrow and this rest of this week. You have made it clear in your teachings, in your word, that because of Jesus, his sacrifice, his blood poured out, we are made, as we accept that, we are made righteous. We are made holy and become your dwelling place. You made it clear in your word that the church is the body of Christ as it does your kingdom work. Father, I pray that for each one of us, we would examine our lives. Are we stuck in a rut where we're making it okay not to do your kingdom work? Are we mistreating your temple? Father, each one of us is the only ones that can answer that question. Pray, Father, that you would use your Spirit now in each of us to talk to us, to help us as we meditate on this. And Father, to open our eyes to things we have in our lives that are mistreating your temple. Not using your temple for the way you intended it to be used. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.